This chart plots European life expectancy since 1970. Look at Eastern European countries like Russia, Lithuania, and Latvia. After the 1989 socio-economic transitions, these lines drop sharply. Meanwhile, in the upper half, Western European trend lines climb steadily upward without interruption. Researchers initially suspected this divergence resulted from a collapse in medical infrastructure or spikes in material deprivation. However, the data showed those physical factors accounted for only about 20% of the gap. The bulk of this mortality gap came from a massive spike in cardiovascular disease, alongside external causes like injury and violence, concentrated primarily in working-age men. The sudden shift from a state-planned economy to a competitive market structure created a localized health crisis. These mortality trends were driven by psychological and behavioral shifts, reacting directly to the changing society. 3 distinct behavioral patterns underpin that cardiovascular spike: heavy episodic alcohol consumption, elevated tobacco smoking, and diets high in saturated fats. We often treat these habits as isolated choices. However, epidemiological data suggests they are downstream biological manifestations of severe structural stress. This scatterplot correlates a population's perceived control with all-cause mortality. Russia and Latvia show high death rates alongside extremely low control. Conversely, nations like the Czech Republic and Poland trend toward the bottom right, reporting higher control and predictably lower mortality. To understand the East-West gap, we must build a precise model of how occupational stress and psychological control dictate human behavior. The first foundational component of occupational epidemiology is the demand control model, originally designed to evaluate industrial-era labor. It defines psychological demands as the volume and pace of a worker's tasks. Control represents their authority over how tasks are executed. When high demands intersect with severely low control, the result is the dangerous quadrant known as job strain. While this model effectively described the stressors of a machine-paced factory line, it provides an incomplete picture of modern transitional economies. This framework misses the psychological impacts of compensation, societal worth, and long-term career security. To address those gaps, Johannes Siegrist introduced the effort-reward imbalance model, an upgraded framework built entirely around the principle of social reciprocity. In this structural diagram, the left side isolates effort, the extrinsic demands and time pressures extracted from the worker. The right side quantifies reward, salary, esteem, promotion, and security. When high effort meets inadequate reward, this violation of social reciprocity tips the scale into distress. This broken reciprocity immediately triggers a sustained autonomic stress response, aggressively flooding the body's neuroendocrine system with harmful stress hormones. The ERI model explains why modern workers suffer physiological breakdowns without engaging in physically strenuous labor. Workplace structures dictate the external pressure, but we must also account for the internal psychological architecture governing the individual worker. Epidemiologists track a static personality trait called overcommitment. It is characterized by an excessive striving and an intrinsic motivation for approval. This creates a paradox. Highly overcommitted individuals will voluntarily maintain an effort-reward imbalance due to their internal drive to perform. This is the intrinsic effort hypothesis, the concept that overcommitment acts as an antecedent, generating health risks regardless of external pressures. Because traits like overcommitment are dispositionally ingrained temperaments, they remain highly consistent even when the work environment changes. Overcommitment acts as the internal catalyst, directly ensuring the worker fully absorbs the toxicity of an unbalanced work environment. While overcommitment is a static trait, researchers contrast it with a highly dynamic socio-cognitive construct, perceived control. Perceived control is the active belief that an individual can intentionally produce desired outcomes in their life. In Eastern Europe, the transition from state paternalism to a chaotic capitalist market decimated the baseline perceived control of entire populations. Biologically, low perceived control combined with high workplace imbalance spikes cortisol and insulin levels, chemically altering the brain to crave high-fat diets. Individuals also deploy alcohol and tobacco as emotion-focused tools to temporarily blunt the distress of low autonomy. The collapse of perceived control removes the individual's final psychological buffer, directly converting structural occupational stress into lethal health behaviors. We can bring these components together into a unified structural equation pathway to map the exact route from society to disease. The macro environment of socioeconomic transition feeds directly into the workplace as a central effort-reward imbalance. Overcommitment acts as the antecedent personality trait, amplifying the impact of those workplace demands. Perceived control sits between that occupational stress and the individual's final response as a mediating barrier. Once that psychological barrier fractures, the pressure flows into specific risky health behaviors: heavy drinking, smoking, and poor diet. Personality traits dictate how an individual engages with occupational stress, but cognitive states mediate whether that stress translates into biological fallout. Applying this unified model to modern medicine demonstrates that treating smoking and drinking as purely intrapersonal failures is structurally blind. Individual-level behavioral interventions will inevitably fail if the upstream occupational stressors and macroeconomic conditions are ignored. Reversing mortality trends requires restoring workplace social reciprocity and rebuilding perceived control. Ultimately, human health functions as the biological tally of our socioeconomic environment.